Everyone. Hi, folks. Welcome. I'm about to start sharing my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see it. All right, so hello, my name is Julia Scott, and welcome to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, also known as the DEIC. This is our Lunch and Learn, Fatphobia, and Social Work Practice. We're really excited to have folks with us here today for this topic especially. Okay. So just to kind of go over for today's agenda, we're going to do some welcome and introductions. We're going to go over our community agreements to kind of set the space, as well as our learning objectives. We're going to go over our speaker presentations, and we're really excited to have two awesome speakers with us today. And then we're going to have a portion for audience questions, and then we'll have a closing out in a survey. So for those audience questions, I know that this was kind of gone over, but you can certainly use the Q&A section to ask questions during our time. So for our community agreements, we want to make sure, particularly in this space today, that you are staying aware of power dynamics when you're asking questions or thinking through some of these things, being an active participant and listener, being open and respectful to different points of view, knowing when to step forward and step back, expecting and accepting discomfort, particularly around this topic. This can bring up a lot of things for people, so please keep that in the front of your minds. Being responsible for your own education, making sure you're taking time to reflect, and being okay with unanswered questions. And once again, taking care of yourself. And let's go to our learning objectives for today. To learn more about fatphobia and its connection to other systems of oppression, identifying instances of systemic weight bias in the current social work practice and policy, understanding, identifying interventions and resources that improve accessibility and affirm fat people, and to learn and create action steps to combat problematic beliefs surrounding fat phobia. I'm going to actually hand it off to Jessica, who's going to go a little about the DEIC.
Thank you. Okay, so just very quickly, I'm going to just talk briefly about the DEIC and our subcommittee, just to give a little bit of context for our end of how this webinar came about. So the School of Social Work's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, DEIC, this is a committee within the school that's focused on fostering an atmosphere of equity and inclusiveness. So it's just a really great opportunity for students, staff, faculty, community members to get involved in social justice work on the campus and building that justice and equity side. You can get involved directly with the committee by attending their meetings. They meet once a month on Mondays from 12:15 to 1:45, and the next meeting is going to be on Monday, March 27th. And it's also going to be combined with the JEDI Awards, which you can contact Julia for more information about. You can also find out more information on both DEIC and the JEDI Awards in the daily bulletin regularly. Additionally, if you are really passionate about a specific topic within DEIC, there's 3 subcommittees. There's equity and accessibility, policy and advocacy, and training and resources. And the training and resources committee is the particular committee that worked with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion today, as well as with our wonderful panelists to bring this particular webinar to everybody. So we just wanted to provide you with our information in case you're interested specifically in our committee or some of the other events that we are putting on this year or have the potential to put on in the future. So our committee works to identify gaps in DEI training at the School of Social Work and to collaborate with other departments. So we develop and support trainings, programs, lunch and learns, really anything. So if you have a specific interest in our committee or in collaborating on an event, reach out to us. Our information is listed here. That's my email address, as well as Scott's, who's also on the call. We are the 2 current co-chairs of the subcommittee. You also can directly attend one of our meetings. We meet on the second Friday of the month from 2 to 3 p.m. If you contact us, we're happy to share that Zoom link. Yeah, I'll give it back to Julia. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Jessica. So We have really two awesome speakers for today, Neathery, Falchuk, and Heather Clark. They are going to share their presentations about fat phobia or anti-fat bias. We want to make sure we leave it to the experts so they are sharing their expertise and understanding of this topic. So first up, we are going to have Heather Clark. I am going to control the presentation, and Heather, you have the floor. I think you're muted, Heather.
So thank you. I'm really encouraged to see so many people interested in this topic today. So yay, I'm glad that you're here. Okay, so I wanted to open with, you can advance the slide. I wanted to open with a super short video, which is on the next slide, to do a quick definition. I think you have to click allow when that comes up. You can't hear it.
You have to approve sharing sound.
Yeah.
Smarter in seconds, fatphobia.
Fatphobia is hatred, fear, and discrimination against fat people.
It is also a fear of gaining weight and fatness itself.
Fatphobia results in the isolation and erasure of fat people,
diet culture, unhealthy relationships with food,
harmful beauty standards, workplace discrimination, and medical discrimination.
Fatphobia is the problem. Fatness is not.
Smarter in seconds.
Okay, so I want to pull out a couple of things from that super quick video, which is on the next slide.
Oh, here's 29 facts about me. My name is Blair Amani Ali. I'm a Scorpio, and my birthday is October 31st. I married this.
Thanks. So the first item I want to pull out from there is the hatred, fear, and discrimination against fat people. The second is fear of gaining weight and of fatness itself. Third is erasure and isolation of fat people. And some of the results, the harmful beauty standards, workplace discrimination, and medical discrimination. So we're going to expand on those pieces in the next slide. A lot of people use the word fat phobia. Neathery and I tend to use the word anti-fat bias instead. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of why we're going to be making that language choice going forward in the presentation. So first, the terminology itself, fat phobia, tends to emphasize the fear aspect because of the phobia part. And not everybody identifies with that fear component. It makes some sense because it follows the language of some other forms of oppression and the language that we use for those other marginalized experiences. It can be a little bit problematic because it doesn't refer to a clinical phobia, which is a very real and valid thing. Some people have actual phobias. And so it can be a little bit confusing because of that. And it tends to provoke some defensiveness in folks when we use that term because of people not really identifying with the fear aspect of it. So we're going to use the term anti-fat bias because it really emphasizes implicit and explicit bias, which, since we're de-emphasizing that fear component, can tend to help people lower their defenses and be like, oh, let me learn about this. It promotes some more of a curious type of attitude. And another key component is it differentiates the systemic and structural issues that are involved in fat phobia and anti-fat bias from the personal ones. So we don't want to like flatten body image experiences with weight stigma experiences. Those are different things. So we're going to use the terms interchangeably today, but I want to clarify that we're not so much talking about like someone having a crippling or paralyzing level of fear of fatness, as we are talking about implicit, explicit bias and the systemic and structural ramifications of those biases. So you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. Okay, so a little bit more on how body image and bias, weight, stigma experiences are not interchangeable. Those are two different, both important, but two different things. I want to elaborate on that a little bit more. Anti-fat bias is a serious, oppressive, and harmful system of explicit and implicit bias that negatively impacts those in larger bodies. And those negative impacts increase in tandem with the size of a person's body. So the smaller a fat person is, the less of the bias they probably experience and those harmful effects. And then the larger a person gets, the more oppression they experience. This is different from the body positivity movement, which is why we're not using that language today. The body positivity movement has definitely been helpful for a lot of people, but it's really zeroing in on that personal aspect, not the systemic. It's really focusing on body image and not weight stigma, and someone's personal relationship between them and their own body. So it doesn't address this systemic bias in the same way. So today we're not really talking about the body positivity movement. I want to clarify that. Okay, so those are some definitions. We've said some brief points about why anti-fat bias, what it is and why it's harmful and in what ways it's harmful. So that kind of begs the question, what do we do about it? So I want to introduce the concept of health at every size, and highlight some ways that health at every size as a movement strives to fight against anti-fat bias. So this definition comes from the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health. That's what ASDA stands for. And ASDA owns the trademark of the term health at every size. The HAES, or health at every size movement, is a continuously evolving alternative to the weight-centered approach to treating clients and patients of all sizes. It is also a movement working to promote size acceptance and to end discrimination and stigma, and to lessen the cultural obsession with weight loss and thinness. Okay, so HAES is defined by 5 core principles. So the first is weight inclusivity. What this principle refers to is accepting and respecting the inherent diversity of body shapes and sizes, and rejecting the idealizing or pathologizing of specific weights. So on the one hand, we understand that people come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, and that it is an aspect of diversity. And on the other hand, we are also not going to idealize or pathologize or problematize specific weights. So we're not going to idealize thinness or pathologize fatness. The second principle is health enhancement. This principle is not so much about emphasizing the imperative to seek help, but access. So this principle is about supporting health policies that improve and equalize access to information and services, as well as access to personal practices that improve well-being, which includes attention to all aspects of health, including physical, economic, social, spiritual, emotional, and more. The third principle is respectful care, which goes hand in hand with the health enhancement principle. So respectful care starts with acknowledging our own biases, and as well as working to end weight-based discrimination, weight stigma, and weight bias. So respectful care also involves providing services from an understanding of social determinants of health, understanding the wide variety of impacts on people's health, including socioeconomic status, race, gender, sexual orientation, age, and all of these other identities that intersect with weight and can impact people's experiences of weight stigma. And also trying to create environments that address these inequities. The last two principles are life-enhancing movement and eating for well-being. And these two principles promote flexible, individualized approaches to movement and eating, and also emphasize pleasure over obligation, and also that emphasize access. So access to a wide variety of foods, access to environments where people can move in ways that they find enjoyable and to the degree that they choose. So that is an overview of the actual HAES principles themselves. I think as we discuss these principles, they can feel a little bit like abstract. So we're gonna try and put some feet on this a little bit and talk a little bit more about what this actually looks like and what HAES is not trying to say as well. So the HAES movement is not saying that everyone is healthy at every size. So it's health at every size, not healthy at every size, which is a common misnomer. And the reason that that distinction is important is because we're trying to unlink health and weight. We're trying to promote health care and access to health care that understands that weight can be one piece of information in someone's, picture of their health, but that it's certainly not the whole picture, and that people can be healthy at a variety of sizes and unhealthy at a variety of sizes, and it's not dependent on their size. HAES is also not suggesting that health doesn't matter. A lot of times people will hear someone coming from a weight inclusive perspective or a health at every size perspective, and the feedback is, so are you just saying that, we should just throw up our hands and forget about, doing things that engaging in health promoting behaviors? And no, that's not what we're saying. We're actually saying that number one, everyone should have access to whatever health behaviors they would like to engage in, and that you can't tell what behaviors someone's engaging in based on how they look. The HAES movement is also not claiming that all foods are nutritionally equivalent. The eating for well-being principle can sometimes be misunderstood. People in the HAES movement will say things like there's no such thing as good and bad foods, or all foods are morally equivalent. This is not, we're not trying to say that, that broccoli and Pop-Tarts have the exact same nutritional content. Obviously that's not true. But we're saying that there's nothing morally different about eating those two foods. And I'll often use this example with clients, like if what your body needs on a given day is, and not even on a given day, in a given moment on a given day is carbohydrate and calories, then in that moment, a healthier choice is going to be a Pop-Tart than broccoli. So the health value of a food is extremely subjective based on the person, the day, the moment, the needs. And so categorizing foods as good or bad or healthy or unhealthy really is not saying much. It's kind of empty language based on the subjectivity of it, and that whether someone is actively engaging in health promoting behaviors involving food and movement has no bearing on their moral value as a person. And there's lots of reasons that people make different decisions about their health behaviors, and it doesn't mean anything about their character or their dignity as a person. The last thing that the Hayes movement is not trying to say is we're not trying to deny the correlation between weight and health. There's obviously a lot of research that shows a correlation between higher weight and certain poor health outcomes. And the Hayes movement isn't trying to say that that correlation doesn't exist. We're just insisting on like rule 1 of statistics, which is that correlation does not equal causation. And we're pushing back against that assumption that just because there's so much data that says these two things are correlated, we're insisting on looking closer and saying, okay, yes, they're correlated. What is the mechanism of the correlation? Reagan Chastain is a fat activist who often provides the example of male pattern baldness and cardiovascular risk. And there's a really high correlation between those two things. But of course, we do not treat someone presenting with both of those conditions with Rogaine or hair plugs. Like that's not that they're correlated, but certainly the baldness is not causing the cardiovascular risk. We intuitively know this. But for some reason, because of fat phobia, because of anti-fat bias, we're losing that instinct that correlation does not equal causation, the truth that correlation does not equal causation, because there are so many assumptions built into weight about personal responsibility, about morality, about character, that it leads us to make this assumption that the weight is causing the poor health outcomes. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so a little bit more about this last point. We know that correlation does not equal causation. First of all, this is like I said, like rule 1 of statistics and like interpreting data. But on top of that, we have several, this citation here is just one of many examples, looking at the various health outcomes across the weight spectrum, which tend to show the overweight category according to the BMI, which is not a helpful measure, but a lot of the research uses it. So this is the category that this research is looking at. Although we could do a whole talk on the problems with this category system, but so the overweight category, according to the BMI, often has the best health outcomes, and the first section of the obese category also has real low health problems, so good health outcomes. And so that like the BMI categories are not correlated with health outcomes. So we know that it's not like, you know, you start here, no, you can't see me. I'm demonstrating. I talk with my hands. I'm demonstrating, but you can't see me. You start with like low BMI and low health problems, and it just both increase together. Actually, no, it doesn't work like that anyways. So logically, the next step I want to take you through is even if they were causally linked, we don't have a safe and reliable way to shrink people's bodies. Like if weight actually did cause these health outcomes that are negative, we don't have a safe and reliable way to sustain weight loss over long term. So again, I could have given you lots of citations here, but one great example is this particular study that I mentioned here. The references will be later, the full reference will be later if you want to look it up. But this is like a meta-analysis of a lot of weight loss studies. What we see again and again repeated in the research is short-term weight loss around the 12-week mark people lose a lot of weight when they engage in any intentional weight loss intervention. And then by 6 to 12 months, we start to see regain. By 2 years, most people have regained all of the weight that they lost. And by 5 years, most people, even more people, a greater percentage have gained back at least what they lost, and then maybe some more even. So there are lots of different specific numbers on what that percentage is. Some people say 80% by 5 years have at least gained back what they lost, and others estimate it as high as 97%. And these are intentional weight loss interventions. The entire goal is weight loss. And we would never prescribe a medication with that kind of failure rate. So even if they were causally linked, there's nothing we can really do about the sizes of people's bodies. We don't have a way to shrink people's bodies that is safe and effective in the long term. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So I want to take this to like its full logical conclusion here. Even if the weight was causing the poor outcomes, and even if diets did work and people were individually responsible for their weight, people still deserve respectful care at every size. And so I like to walk people through that like train of thought, because I think even if you take all of these assumptions that we've got, you know, a growing body of research that we can pick it apart and show that it's not true, I just always like to point out that even if those things were true, it still doesn't excuse anti-fat bias. It still doesn't excuse inequitable access to care. It still doesn't excuse workplace discrimination, because you know, we believe in the inherent dignity and value of each person, regardless of all of the factors. So I hope that's helpful to walk through the kind of logical steps of that. You can advance to the next slide. Oh, that was my last slide. Okay. Awesome. So with that, I want to turn it over to Neathery, who's going to unpack a little bit more on implicit and explicit bias.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Awesome. So we will wanted to share with y'all this awesome graphic that shows how entrenched anti-fatness is in our day-to-day life. So we've got at the beginning ideological level. So this is just the belief, the myth that fatness is inherently bad and is tied to lack of control, moral failure, and this posits that people who are thin are inherently good and that people who are fat are inherently bad. This is a result of racism and misogyny, which I'll get into in a few slides. So at the ideological level, that is just the belief that fat is bad. And we see this upheld in institutional levels where it's present in medical treatment. I saw in the chat, some of y'all have already had lived experience of this weight stigma in action. This is in classrooms, workplace, laws, legislation. It is perfectly legal in most states except for Michigan and maybe another state, I can't remember right now, to fire someone because they're fat, and there's no protection under the law for that. Examples here are desks not fitting students. So this is really applicable to higher education classrooms where are the tools that we're even providing to people inclusive of all bodies. And then of course we see here gatekeeping, barriers to life-saving procedures because of fatness, promoting weight loss surgery, and lack of access to structures like restaurants, facilities, clothing options. So we see this trickle down into the institutional level, which then makes its way to the interpersonal level. And this is where we have interpersonal harm done through fat jokes, critiquing bodies. We start to see obsession of driving for thinness at all cost, saying that someone looks great because they lost weight, and giving dieting advice. Intrapersonal level, now this is going within, so the people in the oppressed group start to internalize these messages. So fat people start to then believe that, yes, I am bad for the way my body exists. I must do everything I can to try to be in a smaller body. And this is where we start to see in social work practice, for sure, we see lots of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, trauma, ways of coping with this oppression. The cycle of socialization, this is developed by Bobby Harrow. This is why anti-fatness is just rampant, because it exists at all levels, and we are born into this. We swim in anti-fatness. We swim in these beliefs that thinness is better and fatness is bad, and we start just being born into it. And then through peers, through family, through school, workplace, healthcare, media, we're reinforced over and over and over again. And it isn't until we get to this action place right here where we start to have a rise of consciousness. We start to notice something doesn't feel right about this. And just because you're attending this webinar means that you're noticing something's not right. And now we have the ability to take an action and change the level of socialization. Otherwise, if we do nothing, we just keep the cycle going. So why are we here? Why is fat bad? Fat people have existed for all time. These statues are amazing artifacts of thousands of years BCE, before the Common Era. So I love having this picture as a reference that fat people have existed forever. And even so, that at this time in human civilization, to have time and resource spent developing and crafting this art, that means fat people were revered. They were seen as symbols of fertility, wealth, knowledge, wisdom. And it was like that in society until the development of diet culture. And what is diet culture? Very briefly, just because I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions and discussion. This is a definition from Christy Harrison, who wrote the book Anti-Diet, and I highly recommend reading that. Diet culture is a culture that worships thinness, equates it to moral virtue, promotes weight loss by any means to attain this higher status. So you can spend time, money, energy trying to shrink your body, even though the research is very clear that almost no one can sustain this intentional weight loss, as Heather was mentioning. Diet culture demonizes certain ways of eating while elevating others. So you become hypervigilant about how you eat, what you want to eat, what you even have access to, and you can feel ashamed of making certain choices. And this oppresses people who don't match up with its supposed picture of, quote, health. And this will disproportionately harm women, femmes, trans folk, fat people, people of color, disabled people, aging people, and it will damage both mental and physical health. Some examples of diet culture, like what is this in practice, would be traditional diets, Weight Watchers, Atkins, wellness diets. So we start to see that popular culture is understanding that dieting is getting some bad press, so to speak. And so they've packaged it now as wellness, that this is for your health. Do paleo, Whole30, keto, which if you've looked at the news lately, they're starting to really show, oh, keto long-term actually is really not great for your cardiovascular system. Who knew? Those of us in the body liberation movement, we knew, and I'm so glad that they're starting to share that more. But again, they're packaging this for your health, for your well-being, and it's actually just dieting in disguise. Cleanses and detoxes, exercise meant for changing appearance, medical procedures, eating disorder behaviors, and the list goes on and on and on. Diet culture itself is a $72 billion industry right now. And if we factor in wellness culture, it's in the trillions. Naomi Wolf, who wrote the book, The Beauty Myth, which was published in the 90s, wrote that a culture fixated on thinness is not an obsession about beauty, but an obsession about obedience. Dieting is the most potent political sedative in history. A quietly made population is a tractable one. And this was written with the focus on female bodies. However, this is applicable to all bodies. So Sonia Renee Taylor, the author and amazing thought leader, she wrote The Body's Not an Apology, and that's another suggestion if you haven't read it yet. She writes here, whose agenda is your self-hatred? Who gets to benefit from that? And I love this image. This shows you who are the founders, the creators of our more modern day diets and wellness plans. And if we just take a look, we get to see there is a commonality. They're thin, cishet white men. Weight Watchers was founded by a thin, cishet and cisgender heterosexual woman. And so there is a commonality here of power and privilege. The roots of diet culture all stem from a moralistic attitude, so very, very Christian normative. The patriarchy, there is sexual prohibition tenets, so we have purity culture, heteronormativity, gender phobia, capitalism, and white supremacy. Going through exactly like the timeline, the details of the roots of diet culture, typically this will take a couple of hours, so we don't have that much time, but I wanted to just give you an overview as well as a resource to further your learning on the history behind anti-fatness. This book, Dr. Sabrina Strings, this is a seminal piece of literature that should be required reading. This is the book Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fatphobia. And this book details and links when we start to see the shift of allowing and kind of revering fat bodies to stigmatizing fat bodies. And this came at the time of the development of race science. So race science was developed in a way to justify enslavement of Africans. It was a way to differentiate European bodies, white bodies, and Black African bodies. So aside from skin color, hair texture, facial features, they continued to say body size was a way of differentiating between white Europeans and Africans, Black Africans. So we see the conflation here of fatness being bad, really originating in the furthering and othering of Black bodies. That tends to get people in disbelief of like, no, there's no way that that's possible because of health, because of the BMI, or really there's just, fat people are just unhealthy. Well, where did we get the idea that fatness was bad in the context of health? The use of the BMI. BMI is everywhere, and it is honestly the worst piece of any kind of healthcare measurement or tool that is out there. Why is that? Well, it was developed in the 19th century, so this is right around the time as well that we see the boom of race science and enslavement of Africans. And so you have to question what the purpose was in trying to study the demographics of French and Scottish participants. So a Belgian mathematician, Adolphe Quetelet, who is not a physician, who is not a researcher with outcome data that shows any kind of validity to a higher BMI equating to poorer health outcomes, wanted to just plot the demographics of a certain region of the world. And again, this was just with French and Scottish participants. in the 19th century, so likely just with cisgender males as participants. It was never designed to measure health and only designed for the purposes of statistics. Over time, we see insurance companies starting to use the BMI, and we start to understand the link here between, this is a quote from Lindo Bacon, about how the pharmaceutical industry, which has a vested interest in making us believe that fat is dangerous and that they have the solution, wrote the BMI standards that are currently used. So insurance companies are using the BMI as a way of, back in the turn of the 20th century, they wanted to know what to charge policyholders. And so they've used the BMI as just an arbitrary delineation as people who have a higher BMI are charged more, because that's just how they made scientific decisions at the time. And again, insurance companies that were mostly run by non-physicians. So to be paid by an insurance company, doctors then adapted and started to use the BMI in their practice. So typically, I would think doctors should lead the way into what is a good health measurement, and then we all adjust. This was reversed. So the insurance company dictated and continues to dictate how care is delivered. Then we see pharmaceutical industry representatives who develop weight loss products, weight loss pills, bariatric surgeries, sit on NIH committees, so National Institute of Health, and CDC committees. And of course, they're wanting to show that their product is needed. And why would it be needed if fat is not bad or seen as a health concern? So it is pretty, I think, very irresponsible that we have very complex financial conflictions with people who sit on these committees and make decisions that impact care. What is the harm of weight stigma? So we see this in the healthcare setting and also in social work practice. We see that weight stigma, which again is any action that is in service of upholding thinness as the ideal. So anyone who does not fit the thin ideal is harmed. We see people avoiding medical care. Access and quality of medical care goes down. Some people have already mentioned that there's been misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis, limitations to what you can even access, fertility treatments, gender affirming care, the list goes on, life-saving procedures in an emergency setting. For someone who's fat, the insurance company might then not pay because they probably didn't recommend doing this procedure on someone who's fat, when really medical students actually don't get fat bodies to work on. They don't actually get to practice their clinical skills. And instead they say, this procedure doesn't work in a higher weight body, but really they don't know because they don't have the opportunity to practice on fat bodies. So aside from medical care, we see impact in sleep, GI function, increase in stress and cortisol, which leads to inflammation. We likely see lots of recommendations of dieting. 1 in 4 dieters will develop an eating disorder. So we see continued psychological harm. We see just an immense amount of shame and guilt, and the list goes on in terms of these physiological factors that are impacted. So what we do know is that weight cycling, so the yo-yoing of your weight, actually is what leads to higher glucose, higher insulin resistance, inflammation, higher blood pressure, higher cholesterol. That change in the body is actually what is causing some of these outcomes that people are saying is just based on fatness. What does this look like in practice? Well, we see a person here. This is a cartoon, but it's not that funny, actually. A person's going to the doctor, I've been impaled. And this doctor, who's not even looking at the person, says, well, maybe you'll feel better if you lose some weight. And that is healthcare, not just healthcare, but that is also social work care. That is in every service provider, there is within implicit anti-fatness. Why? Because if we go back to that cycle of socialization, we're born into this, and it must take active unlearning, active practice in your own divestment of these beliefs. People are dying because of this. People are not getting treated. There's a study that wanted to look at the nutrition levels of people in the ICU, and they were able to see that fat ICU patients were actually malnourished and compared to their thin counterparts in the ICU because the hospital dietitian assumed fat people didn't need to eat as much. So this is really, really, really entrenched and very, very harmful. So again, wanting to make sure we get to questions, I did want to just close with this quote from Virgie Tovar, who is an awesome fat activist. And she writes, when people say they want to lose weight, they often mean, I want to be respected, I want to be loved, I want to be seen, I want liberation from fear and self-loathing. Weight loss culture will never give us those things because it is founded on fear and hate-based systems like sexism, classism, racism, and ableism. So we'll get to questions, but I did want to just leave, in case this is something of interest to you, there is a handout that I have. Let me put this link in the chat. A handout that has different podcasts, different book recommendations, and a free online space where we can continue to offer consultation and really join with community in trying to make some significant changes. So I will stop sharing here. And there's a lot that happened in the chat. I probably won't be able to get to it right now, but I think there's some Q&A that we can get to.
Absolutely. Thank you first, Heather and Neathery, for excellent presentations. We're really excited about this topic, and you were both correct. Some very interesting conversations happening in the chat, folks sharing their own personal experiences and their viewpoints. And so we have a couple of questions, and we have some questions, kind of like some pre-questions in case folks didn't have any, but I'm sure they do. So our first question, I think actually, I'm not sure if you all can answer it, probably maybe on our end. I see that Andy asked about this being a great conversation. As a fat professional, I do get fatigued about being the only person who brings up these concerns. Could this anti-fat bias be incorporated into mandatory trainings? I feel that voluntary informational classes such as these are highly attended by the groups they concern, but not those who may need to be educated about it. So I guess maybe if I were to throw it to you all, how do people maybe incorporate these things in trainings, like whether they be for students or even for staff? Like how can people incorporate discussing fat phobia or anti-fat bias rather?
I'll jump in real quick and just share. I know in my counselor education, we talked about cultural competency and diversity and things like that in almost every class, in addition to having an entire class on it. And never once in my entire master's program was size diversity mentioned. And so I 1000% agree that there is a significant lack of training in this topic for new professionals. So first of all, I love that University of Maryland is doing this and trying to bring, some increased education around this. I know that a lot of us in the field are trying, advocating, looking for ways to help advocate for this to be a mandatory part of education, because it affects all of us. And so many of us do live in larger bodies. So, weight stigma affects everyone, but particularly larger bodied folks. And, so if 50% or more of our clients are likely to be in larger bodies, and we're not talking about that in our provider preparation programs, we are doing a huge disservice to the community. So 100% agree. I also just want to extend some compassion and some resonance as a person in a larger body myself, that it can be exhausting to be constantly providing this education to the people around you. It feels very different in a presentation mode, but in those interpersonal settings, in the workplace, in the school setting, it can feel like a real significant emotional burden. to be trying to justify the validity and the existence of your body at the size that it is. And so I just wanted to offer some compassion and resonance for how difficult that is. And I don't have answers for how to make our system better in terms of training, but you're right. And there are a lot of us advocating for that.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Heather, did you want to add anything or?
Yeah, I did just quickly. So I've spoken at a medical school before on weight stigma, and it's hard because the BMI is just seen as the end all be all. And that starts with not just who decides medical education curriculum, but also insurance companies. So that's where we got to keep pushing. So I think I just was catching up in the chat and someone was denied life insurance because of their weight. Absolutely, right? So this is weight stigma in action. And I would say keep having these kinds of conversations, keep even just recommending different podcast episodes, like make this something you just talk about all the time. And if you have access to people who are making decisions in places of work, schools, I mean, don't even get me started on like what's happening with the Academy, the American Academy of Pediatrics and their decision to say that you can tell fat kids to have weight loss surgery if they are 13 plus. So this is like an epidemic. This is a huge, huge, huge concern that we just have to keep talking about it. So I would say there isn't like a how of like, just do it, just start somewhere. And it is going to be exhausting. And that's why having these kinds of conversations with people who are really wanting to change, wanting to understand, and who have lived experience of this harm is so important and powerful. So just wanted to add that.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to highlight real quick that there's a very practical question in the Q&A on will we be able to access a recording to share with colleagues?
Yes. So I think that the hope, actually speaking to what you all just said, is that we will be able to share this. We're hoping to get this onto our YouTube channel for UMB. So hopefully, if you do want to bring this up in other discussions with your organization, or even in classes, you have something to fall back on and you can share with folks. That's the hope. Okay, so someone said, I'm curious if there's a difference with anti-fat bias within ethnic culture than among genders.
Yeah, I can speak to that. There isn't a difference. Anti-fat bias exists everywhere. I think what is different is just the level of oppression that already exists in having multiple marginalized identities. And then culturally, of course, there is a difference in just food as culture, right? So that's going to be, and there's just so many resources to share. I can't even just like list them all, but there's amazing conversations being had. Petrilli Hernandez is someone who comes to mind, Dalina Soto, who is your Latina dietitian. Just Google them, they're out there. Having amazing conversations about like changing within a culture that cultural foods have been demonized, right? That is part of wellness culture of only have brown rice, but a flour tortilla, absolutely not. It's like, no, we have to be able to embrace and not just and have access to our cultural foods as well. Genders, for sure, we have the overlay here of gender dysphoria and the just the nuanced conversation of navigating wanting to align your body with your affirmed gender with a backdrop of, I'm in Texas where they're starting to continue. I don't know if y'all knew that. I'm in Austin, Texas. They're having bills and policies at the legislature that will limit access to gender affirming care. So again, it's going to be different just in the different layers of oppression that someone has experienced, but anti-fatness is anti-fatness.
Thank you for that. I think this also kind of gets to the kind of intersectional. We had a question about that. Like, you all had mentioned that anti-fat bias has a, foundation in anti-Blackness, right? Like with the book Fearing the Black Body, and how, unfortunately, we're living in a world where we're still kind of like learning and undoing a lot of those things. We're realizing that, oh, wait a minute, like, actually, maybe that's not the answer. And so I think that is also very much tied to that. Another question, Summer said, I just recently over the past years learned about BMI charts for different cultures. What are your thoughts on this?
I can just say BMI charts in general are they're just bad. So I think across the board, they're just bad. What is different though are growth charts. So pediatricians will focus on growth charts with children, like, are they measuring what they're supposed to be measuring, which is a level of hypervigilance that I don't think we need as intense as it is. But growth charts within the United States were only done with white children in the United States. So it is impossible to say Black, brown bodies, children. There's just no way to say what is, oh, you're off of the growth curve here. Of what? Of other white children? Well, that doesn't do anything for Black and brown children.
Mm-hmm. I'll also say, just in terms of like other BMI charts, the children's BMI chart is particularly problematic. They literally just like took the line from the grown-up one and extended it downward for kids. Like, it's unconscionable that it is still used. Don't even get me started. There has been, on a similar note, some conversation in the chat about how do we raise kids if we're born into this really anti-fat biased culture, and it is the water we're swimming in. And that we could have a whole talk on, but because the AAP issue has also been raised, I wanted to let you guys know that there is a local practice named Sunny Side Up Nutrition, local to those of us who are in Maryland or DC. And they are providing some really helpful resources for parents, both for themselves and to give to their kids' pediatricians. And they've been doing this for a while, and they just released some new ones that are specifically related to the new AAP guidelines. So I can make sure that that is on the resource list that we send out. And that's also come up in the chat. Yes, we're sending lots of resources your way.
Yes. Another question someone asked, what are best practices in working with clients who might have internalized fat phobia? As a thin person, it makes me uncomfortable to think about broaching that topic.
Heather, I didn't know if you wanted to share. I've been chatting a lot.
That's so funny because I feel like I have to. It said there was a little thing on there that said that Jessica wanted to answer that. So I was waiting a second.
I'm just going through and making sure they're all marked as answered so we don't get.
Oh, okay. I was like, oh, Jessica wants to respond to this one. Okay. So I would say something that stands out to me in the question is your discomfort. And so that indicates to me, find someone you can talk to about your discomfort about that, who is familiar with these topics, who can really help you work through that. Because if you are a thin provider working with someone in a larger body, they are experiencing more oppression and marginalization than you. And I know a lot of that discomfort can come from, I don't want to do this wrong. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to cause more harm. I don't want to be part of the problem. So first, find someone to do your own processing with. Second, you're going to mess up. We all are. And so I think I just would encourage you that definitely go through the resources, find someone to process with first. And I just want to, perfection is not our goal. Being willing to repair and repair well when we do make mistakes is really much more of an attainable and helpful goal. So those are just two things I wanted to say. Neathery, I'd love to hear what you would say too.
I mean, definitely, I second that. I think even just the transparency of where you are, of even just naming like, hey, there is this inherent privilege difference in the room, and just naming that, and that you have taken this webinar and you're working on unlearning, but you did want to just name that and ask, like, what's that like, and what's it like to work with a thinner provider? Just what's it like, and you can process that relationally. Sometimes fat people may not have even had that question asked, so they might even say, like, oh, it's fine, and move on. But just continuing to be available for that processing while you keep doing that work on your own, which is just getting more and more involved in your own unlearning, more training, reading, because we swim in this. And I often tell clients this too. It is everywhere. Like, if you go listen to the radio, if you watch a show, if sign off on this, you might go check Facebook. It's going to be everywhere. We want to also counter fat liberation messages just as much or more than we get diet culture messages. So this is surrounding yourself in media that really uplifts fat bodies, and really diversify what social media you intake, what you read, who you learn from, and just getting curious about your own personal, like your own social support, your own friends. Who are your friends? And if it's just one type of person, get curious about that. So it's just a forever long process. And I would say first thing first with clients is just naming the inherent power difference.
I guess I'll ask this question. So, we are a university at the School of Social Work, and, these are part of social work. And of course, you're really amongst the people. If you're either clinically, like, meeting with folks, you're working in community with folks. But before that, we're in a classroom, we're in different settings. So how do we bring attention to or disrupt, like, anti-fat bias statements or actions when we're in conversation with people or we're in classes, that can kind of, really kind of disrupt and push against, this kind of systemic issue?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much to be said. I first, like, breathe when you notice something that's said that's not okay, and notice what is arising within you, because it can be super activating. And even just offering, like, a pause, like, hey, something just happened and I'd like to breathe and share with you what happened. Here's what I'm responding to. I'm learning that, and you can just even, like, paraphrase, like, things we've said today. I'm learning that, actually fatness doesn't equate to worth or health, and actually intentional weight loss isn't effective. How can we, like, learn about this together in a classroom setting? There's also such a lack of, and we didn't even have time to get into this today, but there's such a focus on size equating to health, when size is, like, again, nothing to do with health at all. What does matter are the determinants of health. And specifically for social workers, we can talk about social determinants of health. Social determinants of health being trauma, access to healthcare, quality healthcare, experiences of racism, sexism, homophobia, all of those experiences, the neighborhood, early childhood violence, education, if you have access to drinking water. So those kinds of can we expand the definition of health? We are also not dietitians. We're not dietitians who are even trained in eating disorders. And that happens a lot in classes where we go to making nutrition suggestions. Oh, well, we just have to have them stop eating XYZ. And we can just remind everyone about our scope of practice. It's like, we don't have any training to make that recommendation. And that actually comes from our own bias of what, we're assuming fat people are ingesting in their food intake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there is so much more that we could say on, like, all of these questions. Could be a whole talk all by themselves. But I was also thinking that those are some of the, like, what comes back to the 5 principles of HATES. So the eating for well-being, the life enhancing movement, health enhancement, something I talk to clients about a lot, especially because I work at Rock Recovery and specialize with eating disorders. And a lot of times, even if we maybe someday will work on some health promoting behaviors that involve movement and food, maybe, but a lot of times it's not the time yet. There's so much else we can be doing for our health that doesn't even touch what we're eating or how we're moving our bodies. We can work on sleep. We can work on stress management. We can work on social connectedness, because we know isolation and loneliness is actually really detrimental to our physical health. And I think sometimes we think stress management and social connection are like woo-woo, fringy health things, but we have really robust science on those as like significant impacts on our physical medical health. So there's so much that we can do that doesn't even touch food and movement, that is within our scope of practice as therapists. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and just one more thing to note, especially, as your social worker is going into practice, the impact of food insecurity, and just it is impossible to even think about anything else for health other than having consistent and adequate access to not just food, but also culturally relevant food. So someone put in there about the changes that might be coming with SNAP benefits, and even just how SNAP benefits are delivered. It's once a month. That's a binge restrict cycle right there of like, okay, I got to get all this food, and then you have to just wait till the next month, right? So that's where we can make change as best we can in terms of like, let's not even focus on weight. That has nothing to do with anything for all of the other valid reasons, but also we know food insecurity, past or present, will absolutely lead to the development of eating disorders, about 150% likely to have an eating disorder. So that's just another way to expand some of these definitions and really have very more critical and analytical conversations in the classroom. That's what we're there for. And then to just like, don't be afraid to say something. Even if you just say, hang on, I did not like that, and here's why. I'm not sure what else to say. That's totally fine. Just slowing things down and just naming the harm that was just done is amazing, and getting your own support as well, because this is very challenging, especially if you're a student in a classroom. The own power differences within the professor-student relationship. So I just appreciate the consideration of saying something.
Awesome. I'm going to start to wrap up. We can, of course, have this discussion a lot longer, and I'm hoping this is just the beginning of more conversation around anti-fat bias, particularly at our school. So I want to thank Neathery and Heather for wonderful and informative presentations and helping us get together that resource list, as well as Lindsay, who has been who really kind of brought this topic, and we kind of like thought about it. So I'm really glad that this has actually has happened. I'm going to start to share, and we're going to wrap up. So we have some action steps here for our participants. We're hoping that, pausing and breathing, there's a lot of information to integrate and to understand. So it was kind of your first time learning about this topic. Taking time, hopefully utilizing that resource list, read some things, listen, and really start to, just kind of pause. Learning and unlearning is a very difficult thing. So exploring that resource list. And then maybe kind of doing some of your own personal writing with the journal prompt we have here. How would you be with your body if there was nothing to fix? I think that that's an excellent question to think through. I think that Scott and others have started to put some of the resource lists in the chat. So please make sure you download that. We're also hoping to email that out to folks so they have some things to look at. And our survey here, our event survey, I wanted to make sure that people know with these kind of events, we're always trying to get better and do better and bring certain topics. So please complete this event survey just so we know like what your thoughts are with this event, with this training. you can use your phone, scan it with your kind of camera, and it should take you to the survey. And it's pretty quick. Last time I did it. So I'm hoping it should be good. All right. I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank you all for keeping an open mind and asking some awesome questions, as well as having a really robust conversation in the chat. And I want to thank you all once again, Heather, Neathery, Scott and Jessica, Lindsay, and everyone else who helped us with the CPE office to get this event off the ground. And I'm hoping we have more in the future. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Really appreciate being included.
Thank you, everybody.